A long time ago, in a galaxy far, far away, a great adventure took place.
Early on, Lucasfilm had this small movie that nobody knew anything about, science fiction, and they wanted somebody to do a novelization of it. And Judy Lynn Del Rey took a chance. A lot of people didn't want to. You know, they didn't know anything about it. They didn't know what it was going to be. Didn't seem like it was going to be a huge movie, but she believed that it was. And so they did the novelization, and they published the novelization before the movie came out.
Judy Lynn Del Rey, who was running Del Rey Books, had bought the rights, the tie-in rights to Star Wars before it came out. Star Wars had hit, and Judy's stock was riding very high. She had told people that this was going to happen, and she proved it.
So from the publication of that first movie, we had a relationship with Lucasfilm, and that took us through the first 3 movies. It took us to that very first Star Wars tie-in, Splinter of the Mind's Eye, by Alan Dean Foster, which, as we all know, turned out not to be canon, because nobody knew certain things that George had yet to reveal or figure out himself. So that book exists in its own odd little niche in the Star Wars universe. After that, we did some Han Solo novels, 3 of them by Brian Daley, and 3 Lando Calrissian novels by L. Neil Smith. And after that, the license moved to Bantam, and at that point, they had the idea of jump-starting the Star Wars line, because at this point, there'd been no movie for a while, nobody knew what was going to happen, so they decided to try to do books.
It wasn't until the early 90s that we really started to look at how do we bring Star Wars back. That was the pivotal time. We had to recognize that our audience evolved. So, you know, if you were a 10-year-old in 1977 when you saw the film originally, and that was kind of the core audience, certainly the audience that was buying product. By 1990, you're, you know, either finishing college, starting your career, starting a family. You know, you're at a very different life stage. And we started thinking, what, you know, if people are still interested in Star Wars, what would interest them at that stage of their life? And that's when we started to think about things like continuing some of the stories of the characters in the films through novels.
When I wanted to do Star Wars, my boss, Howard Rothman, had asked George if that was okay, if I could just do that. And he said, yeah, as long as we did after Return of the Jedi and not before.
Okay.
So that was the only direction we had at that point. So we kind of just went with it. From the beginning, I had observed Star Trek. They kept changing their thing over and over because they had so many books. But I thought one way to differentiate Star Wars from Star Trek was to maintain a continuity. So we tried to do that from the very beginning.
Star Wars is a mythology. It's story-driven. Our hunch was that what people really craved was to carry the story forward. So we hired a great science fiction author, and he wrote a novel set after Return of the Jedi called Heir to the Empire. And to everyone's surprise, it went to #1 on the New York Times bestseller list and stayed on the list for 19 weeks.
And of course, that was an extraordinary success. New York Times hardcover bestseller, over 1 million copies sold. It really showed the world, and certainly the publishing world, that there was an enormous fan base eager for more experience of Star Wars in a literary area. So the whole so-called expanded universe was really born from that point on.
Nobody really knew whether there was much of an audience out there. Nobody knew they were going to do any more. At that point, the contract was for 3 books, and I don't even know if there was a, well, we'll see what happens later, or if it was just a, well, we'll do the 3 books, and that'll be it. It was when Heir sold so well that suddenly they realized, yes, the fans are out there, yes, they want more books, let's get together and write up some more contracts.
And that sort of started the resurgence of the licensing material. And then they hired a continuity editor at Lucasfilm, and they had a couple of people who had been with the company for a long time. So they decided to have an in-house sort of Lucasfilm publishing, that they would oversee all of the continuity within what they were going to be doing, starting fresh and actually throwing out a lot of what Marvel did because it did not fit into the continuity that they wanted to be canon from the point of the Zahn books, the Dark Empire, and then moving into the expanded universe.
The source material I was given when I started the Thrawn trilogy was from West End Games role-playing game. They referred to the Imperial planet. I think they called it Imperial Center. So I picked the name Coruscant, which means glittering. Since it's a big city, planet-wide city, it seemed a nice sort of touch. Then Lucas announced he was going to do the prequels, and he needed to come up with a name for the planet. Either he decided or was talked into, or a mutual decision, to go with Coruscant, which I'd already had out in a couple of books by that time. So sort of a tail wagging the dog type of thing.
In Heir to the Empire, Tim gave birth to the unforgettable Mara Jade, Grand Admiral Thrawn, and Joruus C'baoth, and he was already thinking of names for the twins Leia would bear later in the trilogy. Heir to the Empire hit #1 on the New York Times hardcover bestseller list, almost unheard of for a science fiction novel at that time. And it went on to sell millions of copies. Tim and I were invited to Skywalker Ranch in San Rafael, California, and had the pleasure of meeting George Lucas, who thanked Tim for his contribution to the Star Wars universe. Talk about somebody walking on air. I swear I could have swung a cat underneath Tim's boots during that encounter.
Hello, Mr. Lucas. Thank you for coming today. We know that you're not going to make episodes 7, 8, and 9, but we also know that you probably thought about it a little bit. Could you share with us, would they have followed the Timothy Zahn books, or did you have something else in mind?
To be very honest with you, I never ever thought about anything that happened after episode 6. I could always say, well, there is a backstory, because I did write the backstory, and I knew what the backstory was, and I had actually spent time on it. But the story is ultimately, as you'll see, now that you can see them all as one movie, you can see that it's actually the Darth Vader story. And I never really thought, even the other books and everything, it just sort of go off on their own path, because I never ever really considered taking that particular story any further.
We wanted it to be one universe. We really felt strongly that that was what it needed to be. But George, as the filmmaker, didn't want to be beholden to somebody else's creative vision. So we would have very interesting skirmishes, because we had a bunch of stuff that became, for the fans, pretty much canon about what happened after Return of the Jedi, what different places in the galaxy were called, and lots of different things. And if he was proposing to do something in the prequels that contradicted that, we would have long debates that usually ended, at least in the first session, with, I don't care, this is what I'm doing. And maybe in the 4th or 5th session would be, well, all right, we could change it this way.
And actually, I will tell you another kind of anecdote. One of the first things I licensed was that Dark Horse, the Tom Beach and Cam Kennedy thing. I got out of the Marvel deal and gave it to Dark Horse. But what Tom Beach, the story he wrote, we were just kind of letting people do what they wanted then. He wrote his story. I didn't ask George anything. We published it. Later, George would run into me and he'd say, Lucy, I would never clone the Emperor. He doesn't get cloned. And I'm like, how am I supposed to know that if you don't want to be involved in what we're doing, and yet if I do something you don't like? So I started then having to send him memos. This person wants to do this, and this. Is this okay? Is that okay?
One of the things while working on The Essential Reader that I came across, and I make mention of it in this book, is a very strong telepathic connection between Mara and the Emperor, which is a level of force communication that is not existent in the films, really. And that discussion actually surfaced, and this is what the research I found. It did end up being in a memo that went to George, and George okayed it. It was just presented as a yes or no question, could Mara do X? And he was fine with it. So it goes to show that at that time, that was the level of communication and stuff that had to be vetted in the process. So.
At the time, the way it was explained to those of us authors that when we sent material in, we were allowed to ask up to 5 yes or no questions that they would take to George to be answered. Very early on in the planning stages, because I was filling out the entire squadron, I asked whether or not it would be possible to have a Mandalorian in the squadron, just because I liked that look. Lucasfilm said that George had said no, that George apparently had something in mind for them at that point. But otherwise, no, Lucasfilm was very generous.
George had ideas of what he wanted to do with the characters beyond Return of the Jedi, but he didn't tell anybody. He just let them come back from Lucasfilm with red marks saying, well, you can't do this, and you can't do this, but this is good, this is good, this is good. Yeah.
The sense of where things are going to go after, episode 6, which is that the Senate will come back and it'll become a democracy again, because now we know what a democracy was when it started, which was really in episode 1, even though it was not very effective because of the corruption and the petty fighting.
The original saga was about the father, the children, and the grandchildren. And that's not a secret to anybody. It's even in the novels and everything.
Eventually, when Lucas decided not to pursue the third series of sequels after Jedi, he just opened up the expanded universe and said, okay, we are hiring you people to add to this universe, but we will control what is added to it.
By the time we were in the middle of the Thrawn trilogy, they had, I think, another 12-book contract between Lucasfilm and Bantam, and were passing out the books to various authors. So Kevin J. Anderson, Kathy Tyers, Dave Wolverton, I think, were the first 3.
My editor called me and she said, "What do you think about Star Wars?" And I started talking to her about the archetypal storyline and why I liked it. And she says, no, what I mean is, would you be willing to write a Star Wars novel? And I said, yeah, I'd like to. My wife and I had just watched, 7 Brides for Seven Brothers. I thought, it'd be kind of fun to do something a little bit like that. I just didn't think that Leia and Han could get married that easily. And I wrote the outline, sent it off to Lucasfilm, and at that time, George Lucas was actually going through and he read the outline and made a couple of notes and basically said, "This sounds really cool," and we were able to go ahead.
Timothy Zahn's series, The Heir to the Empire, and his other books had been published, and I was at that time writing Truce at Bakura for Bantam Spectra. I was just incredibly honored to be the lead off, and they assigned me a time. They said, we want this to take place immediately after the Return of the Jedi. And there was really only one idea that had really grabbed me. So I said, okay, look, this is the one that I want to write. And that is that some aliens show up in the Star Wars universe who are so evil and so nasty that just for once, the Empire and the Rebel Alliance stop shooting at each other and work together.
In 1993, I think, late 93, Bantam approached me and said, we'd got a series of Star Wars books coming out. We'd like you to do the last one, kind of bookend it since you started it. And I said, okay, that would be fun, but I need to have 2 conditions for that. I spend the time to do the book. One is I want to end the war between the Rebellion and the Empire. And 2, I want Luke and Mara to get together. It seemed to me that Luke needed a companion, maybe a wife at some point. The Thrawn trilogy was obviously way too soon for that. It felt very artificial that they had fallen for each other at the end, given that they'd started a few months earlier in Heir to the Empire with her hating him. So I wanted to just let them start a friendship at that point. They needed some time just to be friends. Mara had baggage, Luke had baggage, and to work it out, I tried to do some of that in the Hand of Thrawn duology.
And it's amusing because we would read things on the internet, people who would say,
I know this for a fact. Lucas will never let Luke get married. Don't ask me how I know, but I've got an inside track. And we're standing there looking at each other. Sure you do, fella.
The amusing part of that was that this was end of 93, 94, with Spectre of the Past coming out in 97, Vision of the Future 98. And I'm sitting there knowing that we've already got it set up. The other authors know it too. No one ever breathed a word of it. There was a secret that came all the way to the end. It was a deliberate effort on everybody's part, but it was amusing to watch the speculation.
The thing with Star Wars, they actually did let the characters change. The comparison at the time was Star Wars books and Star Trek books. And Star Trek books had this rigid rule that you could never change anything ever, period. And the Star Wars books actually gave us the freedom that you could tell it in an overall time frame. You could have things really change, like when Han and Leia have their little twins, or they get married and they have their twins in Tim Zahn's books, or in my books when Luke founds the Jedi Academy and starts training new Jedi Knights. These things carry through, and the story really does keep going. I think a little part of the problem with the epic sweep and all that in the Bantam era books were that none of us wrote them according to an overall plan. I did my books, which set up some things, and other people had to take it from there and run with it. But the new Jedi Order series, somebody planned a giant story all the way through.
I remember at a book fair sitting around with Kevin Anderson, who'd written some of the earlier books, and some of his friends, these other science fiction writers. I don't think any of the other guys had even written Star Wars. And I was kind of complaining that the Bantam books they weren't doing so well anymore. Each person was just writing their own thing, and it was kind of the sales were going downhill, and it wasn't so exciting anymore, and it needed something major to happen to the program. So I'm sitting around, and Kevin said, there's other science fiction series where people come up with a multi-story. And I thought, that's a good idea. We should do that.
A long time ago, when Babylon 5 was on TV, I had dinner with a bunch of the Lucasfilm people who were in charge of all the publishing, and it was me and my wife Rebecca, as well as my friend Christine Catherine Rush, who wrote the Star Wars book, The New Rebellion. And at the time, when I was writing the books, and Timothy Zahn and Kathy Tyers and Mike Stackpole, we were all writing these books that we'd pick our own time frame, we'd write our own books, and they weren't coming out in chronological order, and Lucasfilm was just talking about putting out a timeline to say, this is the order that these new novels are taking place in. In our dinner conversation, we were talking about how neat Babylon 5 was, that this guy had the entire 5-year story arc planned, and he just did these episodes, which told parts of it throughout the 5 years. And we had this great conversation at dinner thinking, wouldn't it be great if Star Wars came up with something where it was an overall big, epic storyline that we just broke it into pieces and different authors would write different novels about it. Does that sound familiar to any of you guys now later?
Jedi Order.
Well, we talked about that, and I thought that would be a great idea.
We were just going to be starting to do the licensing for the prequel movies. So I thought, I'm just going to hold on to this idea and make it part of the new deal. Whether we go with Bantam or Ballantine or whatever ends up happening. I mean, it was a hairy negotiation. Bantam also wasn't paying the authors royalties anymore. I wanted them to get paid royalties, and I wanted a really good science fiction editor now. Specifically, I wanted Shelley Shapiro, and she was at Ballantine.
At that time, the license was coming up was Bantam Doubleday Del.
Yeah. Everybody wanted
was losing the license, and the movies had been announced, so everybody wanted the license for the adult fiction books. And so really one of the oddities of Star Wars, kind of a little bit of minutia, when Del Rey and Bantam Doubleday started this bidding war that drove the price up, and then a week after Del Rey won and they were all having parties, the mother company of Bantam Doubleday Del, Bertelsmann, bought Random House, which is the mother company of Del Rey, and the two imprints wound up like one floor apart in the same building.
So anyway, Ballantine ended up getting the deal. Then we could all get together, because here now we had a brilliant science fiction editor. Now we had a concept for a multi-book thing where we could bring really great new blood into the series. I was always trying to turn Star Wars into real literature. When you do become successful, then everybody wants you to do the same thing all the time. And I never want to do the same thing. I always want to learn something new, I'm constantly, for me, it's mostly about experimentation and learning, figuring something new out. And
when we took over the Star Wars franchise from Bantam, now Bantam is us, so it's all come full circle. But when we took it over and I was handed the fiction, my concern was that we try as hard as possible to not keep repeating the same old. No more, super powered weapons of the week. No more, I wanted the characters to be real. I didn't want, Luke was getting to where he could beat anything with his hands tied behind his back and his eyes closed, and there was I wanted a little bit more sense of danger, more sense that the characters could be in peril, and some growth to make them, not comic book characters, and I'm not putting down comic books there, but you can only do so much characterization there. I wanted to make them real novels as much as possible. And I figure, in a way, continuity is not my primary job. My primary job is trying as hard as I can to make them the best novels they can be. So that's what we started out with to begin with. And we've been trying to push the envelope where we can. Obviously, we don't do anything that's not approved. And we work very closely. We have a great relationship with Lucasfilm. We work very closely with them. We have great brainstorming sessions where we get together in person and just hash out all kinds of ideas and plans. And that's like one of the most fun parts of the job, actually.
What's happening here is that there's suddenly this huge new jolt of energy in the Star Wars universe. And I think the beauty of that is that it kept it from stagnating. We were able to take it and just explode in new directions.
I started mulling over what could come up with a story that would be big enough in the Star Wars universe that could cover, we had no clue how many books it would be, dozens of books or 10 books or something like that. And what I started thinking of is I had this weird image of Cloud City on Bespin and the Tabana gas mines and Lando Calrissian standing on Cloud City when he's looking out at the clouds, and totally unexpected, this gigantic alien ship rises up from the clouds, from the core of the gas giant planet. I thought of it like the mothership from Close Encounters of the Third Kind, just this huge thing rising up out of the gas giant and opening fire on Cloud City because somehow or other we've pissed off this race of aliens that lives in gas giant planets that nobody even knew existed there. And I thought that would be pretty cool if now suddenly you have this. And I made up, what if this race of aliens that lives inside gas giant planets, what if they travel from planet to planet through like dimensional doorways or Stargate kind of things, so that we never saw their ships flying around? They have this entire interconnected empire that's all around these gas giant planets, and nobody even knows it's there. And I thought that would be a cool setup for Star Wars. What if suddenly, now that the empire is all defeated, that these big kick-ass aliens started coming up out of gas giants and attacking all the New Republic stuff. And I started developing this and thinking how really cool this was going to be. But before I could propose it to Lucasfilm, they came up with their new Jedi Order thing, and they went off, and I went, well, this is too good of an idea. I'm going to come up with something that I can use this in. So that's where Seven Sons originated almost, is I had developed it as a different idea for a long-running Star Wars epic, kind of like the new Jedi Order.
When the Star Wars license was held by Bantam Books, they were doing limited series. They would do maybe a trilogy, but a lot of their novels were standalone novels. So when they surrendered the license for whatever reason, and Del Rey reacquired the license to publish Star Wars novels, the thinking both at Lucasfilm and at Del Rey was, well, let's do something completely different. Let's create an epic series. It was originally planned to be like 25 books long. And I was asked by my editor at Del Rey to come to join that project because of my experience with Robotech. So when I went out to Lucasfilm for the first meeting to discuss what would turn out to be the new Jedi Order, I was just there as a consultant.
Del Rey did not want to use any Bantam authors. That had been one of the things they had decided they were not going to do. But for a variety of reasons that really are not germane to this discussion, Lucasfilm told them they had to use me. So I got to be one of the people that went up to do the discussions about how they were planning to do things. And it was very weird for me to be in a room at Lucasfilm because there were guys, I'd been doing comics for Dark Horse. So there were guys from Dark Horse that I knew. There were the Lucasfilm guys that I knew. There were these Del Rey people who I didn't really know very well. I didn't know Shelley at all, but I knew her assistant pretty well. And then Jim Lucino was the other writer there, and the Lucasfilm people were there. I was the only person in the room that had read Tim Zahn's last novel. So since this was going to be a continuation from that, all the questions had to go through me for can we do this or can't we, which had a whole bunch of people's noses out of joint. I actually enjoyed it, but
when I first met Mike, he was the scholar. He was the one when Del Rey got the publishing license back. He sort of was the one who came over from Bantam and just had all these great ideas that we worked with in the new Jedi Order and some other things.
It's sort of like the NJO. I think of it as you had those few early books, Brian's books and Alan Dean Foster's books. Then we went into the whole Bantam thing. So by the time we got to the NJO, it was sort of like the third generation. And Mike was the guy, he knew the second generation. He'd contributed so many books, and he had a really vast knowledge of all of that Bantam material, which, to my thinking, had to be brought forward, had to be moved into the new Jedi Order. We couldn't just jettison all of that. So,
was there ever a debate to jettison it?
Yeah, there was. There was some talk about let's start from scratch. In fact, I got a lot of pushback about that I was trying to bring in too much of what had been set down in Bantam, and it was good. The idea was, well, we want new readers. We don't want to have readers, who are going to feel shortchanged because they jump into a series and they don't have all the backstory. But I just didn't see how we could get rid of that. Like I'm just this continuity nut. I wanted all of it to flow, as though it were one long tale.
We were telling new stories, and we knew that to have all these different writers writing new stories in different media, we had to lay down some ground rules. And the most important rule was something called continuity. All these stories had to be consistent with the movies, but also consistent with each other. Otherwise, the integrity of the mythology would be stripped away.
I thought one way to differentiate Star Wars was to maintain a continuity. So there's, now a database of all that stuff that when I hired Leland to do that, because after a while, nobody could remember. It's amazing sometimes when you hire the absolute perfect person for the job.
Yes.
So I've been the keeper of the holocron since I started in 2000. It was a brand new position, and it was actually we were starting up a new role-playing game with Wizards of the Coast, and it was decided at that point that they would need some sort of database to keep track of all the expanded universe material that was coming out.
What'd they have before then? Just like some index cards, little tin box.
They had. When I got here, it was a Bible. It was an expanded universe Bible. I don't know if George has his own Bible or not, but it had covered much of the episode 1 stuff, and then there was another binder that covered the pre-episode 1 stuff, and then we had New Jedi Order was starting out around at that same time. So we had, I think, a New Jedi Order Bible. These are glossaries,
To a certain extent, back in the Bantam days, it would be the authors talking to authors about, hey, can I pass this back and forth? Yeah, and when I was doing iJedi, I remember talking to Kevin about using some of the sets and what was going on there. And Tim and I did a lot of work pitching stuff back and forth. When it went to the new Jedi Order, that was a lot more literally set up. Outlines were prepared and offered to authors, so there was more direction on that sense.
With the new Jedi Order, we were going to have 1 trillion authors, so we started it off with the initial authors and Lucasfilm, and we all discussed it, conceptualized it, got things approved, got things disapproved, figured things out, and then it started growing on its own.
We all went up to Skywalker Ranch, and we had a round of talks for the better part of a day, talking about what we thought we needed, what elements should go in there, and so we kind of hammered out a general story arc, and sort of looked a little bit more, did a little bit more focus on roughly the first 6 novels, and then we all went away and then returned later back to Skywalker Ranch to go through sort of a second round of modifications of how all of this stuff was done.
In those story meetings, we tossed around a lot of ideas, and out of those ideas, I was hired to write an outline which we could submit to George Lucas, which we did, and he objected to some things and approved most of it.
For the new Jedi Order, the big ideas behind that series regarding some of the characters, we did have to have his permission to do certain things, some ideas he nixed right away. But he had very limited involvement. He created a team to oversee the novels, and it was separate from what he was doing with the films. He always reserved the right to contradict anything that was done in the expanded universe in his films. So I mean, it was always his franchise. We were just participating in a very in a somewhat limited way, telling stories.
I have had other dealings with George. Not that he gets deeply involved, but he is available to answer certain questions about characters or plot points.
Lucasfilm tries to guard the canon very carefully. So authors are required to submit very detailed outlines. And there are several people who look those outlines over and make sure that issues of canon are not being violated.
We had certain objectives that we wanted, and suffice it to say, I mean, there were some original design ideas that we had, and certain timing issues, certain events that we thought should happen earlier or later in the series that didn't. We were able to put together a plan, and that plan, as Von Moltke said, no plan survives contact with the enemy.
Exactly.
So that plan, from what we had in the beginning, that plan certainly morphed as things went through the series, but it was a very cool thing. I worked with Sue Rustoni to make sure that, we were all cool on how things went together, and Sue is great.
It's got to stay within Star Wars sensibility. It's got to be recognizable as Star Wars. Those are the things that we look at as far as, and it has to be PG-13. Possibly, yeah. But other than that, it's a case-by-case basis. I personally don't like gratuitous violence, so I don't let that in the books that I read. It just depends. But no, there's no sanctions, official sanctions, other than, the no touching, no tongues.
Wills?
Yeah, the wills.
Will we ever hear anything about the wills, the Journal of the Wills?
Not too much. George has told us to leave that vague. I think there are mysteries that are going to remain unsolved for some time until he gives us his okay and explains it to us.
I was going to mention a couple things about the outline because I'm so fascinated. Now, I'm a little bit helped by Pablo Hidalgo's book, The Essential Reader's Companion, where he sort of laid out some of this. He wrote a little bit about this initial outline that you guys put together. He writes here, he says, in the earliest depictions, Luke Skywalker was sending 3 solo children on an epic quest during which they'd encounter a female character from an invading species sent to infiltrate the galaxy. This unnamed female corrupts Anakin, nearly turning him to the dark side, but instead she falls in love with him, and Anakin redeems her, and in a fit of intense sibling rivalry, Jason and Jaina turn on Anakin, and the resulting conflict tragically ends with Jason's death. And then it also discusses the Sith, sort of Sith enemy in that storyline. What was your recollections of that first outline?
That was before I had been brought in.
Really?
Yes, I had nothing to do with that. That's the first thing that I was shown, but that was tossed pretty quickly.
That must have been
And
tossed early.
yeah, it was tossed early, and I don't even know who was responsible for that. I think Shelley played a part in that, but yeah, that was before I was brought in. I think
Okay.
because it had been shot down, that's when they started, reaching out like, maybe we need to get some other input on this series.
Was that when Michael Stackpole joined as well?
Yeah, Michael was already on board before I was asked. So, yeah, he may have been familiar with that early outline. I don't know. I don't know about that.
Yeah, and I know George said no to the Darksider thing because
Right.
I guess his reasoning was that they would have destroyed themselves.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right. He didn't want more. He didn't want the Yuuzhan Vong to be Siths, have Sith powers. Understandable. Totally understandable. Changing Anakin, Jason around, and beyond that, I don't think George weighed in very much.
Now, speaking specifically, Pablo has actually provided the actual words that George wrote on the outline regarding Anakin and Jason. And this is what he had said. This is from May 1998. He writes, "Change the person who's responsible for ultimately saving the day to Jason, not Anakin." And that was listed under a header that George wrote, "Too redundant to movie storylines. Books should be more original."
Yes.
And then he circled the part of the outline that said that Anakin was the prophesied one. So can you talk about that thing with Anakin and Jason?
Yeah, I do remember that we did create an outline where we had Anakin being the one, and got back from George that very document saying you can't go this way. This is too much like I am working with my own Anakin, that we can't have two Anakins. We can't have people confused. Yeah.
And it sounded quite similar. The prophecies, the dark side, the final battle.
Yeah.
No one had seen the prequels, so they didn't know that they were.
No, we didn't know. No, we had no idea. No idea.
I wonder if he read that and he goes, "Where'd they get this?"
There's a spy in my midst, right? Exactly.
I'll be honest with you. I think his comments that he made, without them, we would never have gotten the Yuuzhan Vong.
Right. That's true. Yeah.
I think honestly, I think he helped the expanded universe as much by his no's as he did by his yeses, which were more rare. Yeah. Lucy Wilson. She's such an interesting person. George's secretary and typed up A New Hope and all this crazy stuff.
Right.
She said when she came up with the idea of doing the new Jedi Order, she really wanted to make what she described as Star Wars literature. But she wanted to make something that felt really literary. And so I was going to ask you, because I think you worked with her, what was it like working with her? Like, what were some of her sort of contributions? What did she bring to the table during that process, if you remember?
Yes, she's largely uncredited in terms of NJO. So I remember at the early meetings, she would have a big blackboard. And on that blackboard, she had written out like the whole hero myth that comes right out of Jung and, so many other people. And her idea was that we should, when we're writing the series, that we should kind of follow those guidelines, the hero myth for the series. And so that was right up my alley. I love that because, that's what I'd like to do anyway. And so she always encouraged us, like in those early stages, to, dig into mythology for the creation of these characters and especially the character arcs. So when I sat down and did the Bible, I was thinking very clearly about character arcs and taking people through that mythic journey that she wanted. But she was only involved in like the first couple of meetings, and I don't remember what happened. I think either she got sidetracked into trilogy that George was working on then on the movies, and then left Lucasfilm shortly after that. So her input into NJO after those initial sessions was almost non-existent, but she was the impetus for the way the series developed.
That's amazing.
And and she was there like all the way back when Brian Daley was writing the Han Solo books. Like, she had input into the literature side of things. Well, basically, George put her in charge of that. And I think Lucy and all that stuff about the hero's journey came really from George. I mean,
Okay.
he was into that even earlier. So she probably picked up on it, and maybe that was her speaking for George. Like that. This is what George really likes, and this is what we need to do.
The Yuuzhan Vong was something they came up with for the new Jedi Order. Part of that, Mike Stackpole and I, as they were nearing the end of the 12 books that Bantam had contracted with the Lucasfilm, we were going to pitch this continuing saga that wound up being the new Jedi Order. But before we could do that, there was a bidding war. Del Rey took the license from Bantam. Mike helped steer the storyline for the NJO, but the Vong was created by that group rather than we hadn't specifically decided on what the villain was going to be.
So that's my favorite villain, other than Thrawn, because it was so cool and so different from anything you'd ever seen.
Yeah.
In the first meeting that we had up at Skywalker Ranch, we were kicking around a lot of different ideas, and we knew some of the things that we wanted or didn't want. Certain edicts that were passed down that Mr. Lucas would like or would not like, and I remember very specifically Jim Lucino, who was sitting next to me, commenting and just sort of saying, using the Aztecs as a model, or at least their cosmology as a model, that would work out pretty cool. And I concurred.
At that first meeting, they put me on the spot because I had never been to Lucasfilm before. When they asked me to sort of come in as a consultant, I thought, okay, I don't know what I can contribute to this. And so I was sitting around at a table. I had just come back from Guatemala. So I was, I had a lot of Mayan stuff in my head.
I spent a lot of time in Guatemala, Mexico, and Honduras, hiking to the most remote Mayan sites that haven't even been excavated. And I have always been, for 40 years, I've been drawn to the Maya.
Steve Saffel knew that I had just come back from a trip. So when we were all at the conference table, he just threw me this thing like, hey, Jim, you just got back from your Maya expedition. How about talking about the Maya and the Aztec and as a possibility of using them as a basis for some villains? And then it just opened up, and I had to give this long spiel about the Maya and the Aztec. And then when I was asked to write the Bible, I was able to really bring in a lot more of what I'd been thinking about in terms of the Maya and their approach to religion, to cosmology, to life and death, afterlife, all of that stuff.
So on the Aztec, see, this is what caught my attention initially. They have this mythic history of their people and that they're a wandering tribe and they're looking for a new home, which will be signaled, of course, by the famous image of the cactus and the eagle. And was this an inspiration for you when you're thinking of the Yuuzhan Vong leaving their home galaxy to this one?
Yeah, that was on my mind. I drew mostly from Maya, but in terms of that journey to a new destination, finding a promised land or whatever, I was thinking of the Aztecs and Aztlan. Yeah. And really, we were really sort of modeling them on like the Aztec in the very beginning. Just this, again, in terms of this gray area, with the Yuuzhan Vong, were like the Aztec in the sense that they thought that, they believed that their gods need to be nourished by blood. Their gods needed blood. And that's why it was fine to sacrifice. It was fine to kill because it was all done in the name of their gods. I mean, the Aztecs sacrificed countless tens of thousands of captured warriors, but not just to be barbaric, but to nourish their deities. That was their belief.
Now I have to ask about Yuuzhan, and I hope I say this right. Tzlactecutli, the dismembered Aztec god that creates the universe from their body parts. It's got to be that's the inspiration.
Yes.
Okay. Because it seemed very direct, and I liked it. I mean, I thought.
Yeah.
So
Oh yeah, I stole wildly. Or borrowed.
Yeah. I was reminded of like the Pochteka. I hope I'm saying that right. And these are these Aztec spies and these scouts who they'll change their appearance to blend in. They'll meddle here on the outskirts. I mean, was that in your thinking for people like Nomenor and Yeoman Carr? Or?
Yeah. I mean, there were always characters like that who would either be traders, merchants or something like that would infiltrate other societies, but they're really espionage personnel more than anything else.
On the Mayan side, I was struck by the mythology. You have the twins in the mythology for the Mayans. Was that coming in with Jaina and Jason as the twins for the Vong?
Yeah, I thought about that. I didn't want to make it too right on the nose, but yeah, the hero twins were a lot in my thinking about that. But Jason and Anakin weren't together long enough to really work that out mythically, where they were going to be a team going forward.
Jason and Jaina, or
well, any of them, Jason and
I wanted to ask you just real quick about just more about the Yuuzhan Vong. So I know that they had all the book covers and all these different illustrations, but sometimes they're quite distinct. I mean, how did you visualize in your mind's eye? How did you picture the Yuuzhan Vong looking?
I think I was really thinking about the Maya, the body deformations, the sacred tattoos, the piercings, just sort of an alien version of the Maya are pretty alien anyway, but I think that's the way I envisioned them, just with everything being done as a sacrifice, giving blood because the gods had given blood. So giving blood back and piercing yourself and letting that be a sacrifice, or sloping your head to make yourself look like a jaguar or whatever, So, I mean, I did have all that in mind in the way I was envisioning them. Again, that's one of those things where other writers, saw different things.
As the Vong were being sort of designed, as we were all kicking ideas back and forth, that was kind of where it started. But the other things were layered in, like their hatred for technology, and so as you sort of have an image and then you're warping it with these other conditions that they have to do this and they have to do that, other things have to be organic, et cetera, you get this, the idea of Aztecs, slowly transforms itself. And so that was really, it was really, really cool. And that's one of the best things about having those meetings where everyone's brainstorming, because you get brilliant ideas kicking back and forth and people putting little twists on it. So it really is not the creation of any one person, but this, creation of, it shows what a committee can do well, as opposed to, doing badly in most businesses.
If you look at the evolution of the EU, the Yuuzhan Vong made sense. It made sense to go there because you had to have the new big to keep it going.
With that invasion story, I wanted to ask, were you guys inspired by like H.G. Wells with the sort of War of the Worlds, or even things like Independence Day? When you're thinking of how do we do an invasion story, are you going from whole cloth, or are you pulling from other things, do you think?
Probably unconsciously pulling from everything, but there was no template for it. But I mean, you can't help but draw from everything that you've read or seen, so I'm sure all that stuff was in here, just kind of bubbling out, and I'm sure that's the same is true for everyone who contributed.
I know in the Aztec culture and in the Mayan culture, the snakes have such an importance. I mean, was that when you're thinking of amphistaffs as the weapons, was that your thinking?
Yeah, I think that came though from I think that was Bob's.
Okay.
A lot of that, Bob Salvatore, really contributed a lot to that. Everybody brought specialties to the series.
I had a meeting after I got asked to do the book. This was long after Del Rey and some of the authors, Mike Stackpole was one of them, probably the primary one actually, and Jim Lucino, and Lucasfilm all got together at the ranch, and they did the basic outline for NJO. And they came up with the Vong being these kind of forceless barbarians from another galaxy. And originally what I was told is they were going to be, they hated technology, so they had a particular dislike for droids, for example, considering an insult to life. But they were basically flying around in techno ships using bioweapons. And there was a logic error there I think we all recognized. And then I was on a plane flying out to the first meeting I was going to have. It was at a convention that I was going to anyway. I was going to be meeting with Jenny Smith, who was then the assistant editor, and Shelley Shapiro, who is the editor at Del Rey that's handling the Star Wars books. And on the plane out there, I was just thinking about the Vong and saying, let's give them all kinds of biotech. I mean, if they're going to be biotech-based, why do they have to have any connection at all to our type of technology? Let's make it as foreign as we can. So when I got out there, I started talking about things like ooglith cloakers and ooglith maskers and thud bugs and amphistaffs and all this other weird stuff. And when they figured out that I wasn't doing heavy drugs, they said, "Hey, that sounds pretty cool."
So that was a concern at one point.
Well, have you read the Vong?
Oh yeah. We
thoroughly
love it.
Enjoyed it.
Yeah.
Did you picture like the coral skippers or the Vong? Did you see them as more muted tones or more colorful?
My instinct would be that they were just very monotone, not very colorful, almost bony and just gray and white and evil looking on their own.
Yeah,
but I mean, I could see it another way too. And maybe splashes of color now and again, but not overwhelmingly bright or anything.
One of the other ideas, in comics, it always helps to have characters and come down to like physical combat between two characters.
Sure.
And, I don't think the Yuuzhan Vong had even been named yet, but these invaders from this other galaxy, I suggested that we give them weapons that were fire-based. So instead of lightsabers, they had fire sabers.
Oh.
And that would allow the Jedi to actually go toe-to-toe with them.
Sure.
And I don't remember why that was shot down. I got the impression that Del Rey didn't like it.
Yeah.
And
it would look better in comics.
It would look better in comics, but so what are the Yuuzhan Vong going to do against Jedi?
Snakes.
Yeah. And so I just thought, all right, I'm done giving ideas that are not going to be either they're not going to be accepted or they're not going to allow us to use them.
Right.
And so we didn't do anything with New Jedi Order for years.
I mean, I know you mentioned they've changed with different authors, but were they initially more of a shadowy presence, or did they move? Like, were they as much in the forefront as they were initially outlined, or did that happen?
That happened. That changed a little bit too. Yeah, it was a little bit more mysterious in the beginning. I thought like a slower rollout would have been better, but worked out. Yeah.
I think it's fascinating throughout the series. Initially these guys are so menacing and you get the sense of evil, but it's kind of subverted because it ends up being a clash of cultures. And I thought that was very fascinating because that's something that was important to you.
Yeah, it was important to me.
Now, were you inspired at all when you're looking at the caste system? Was that inspired, especially with like the shamed ones? I think of the untouchables from India. Was that inspired by that?
Yeah, I was thinking that, and also the Mayas seem to have a similar kind of caste system, with warriors and merchants, and really their untouchables were captives, who they put to work either building pyramids or doing sculpture, whatever. So they had their own, and those, those groups tended not to live in the ceremonial centers, but had their own precincts. So I was thinking about that kind of thing.
And it fits as well, because for such a hierarchical system, there is a bottom,
Right. There has to be yeah.
In the course of the discussions, one of the things that we wanted to do with the new Jedi Order was we wanted to make a break from the way that Bantam had been doing stuff. In the Bantam books, if you recall, they were all standalones or trilogies, or occasionally a set of 4 with the X-Wing books. And nobody ever died. There was no credible threat. You knew the Magnificent 7 characters, and then the next tier of 7 characters with, Wedge and Mara Jade and Talon Card and Corrin. You knew none of them were ever going to die. Okay? We didn't have red shirts, but you knew if a character was introduced in the first 3 chapters, they were vulnerable. But if they made it through the end of a book, they were not going to die. I mean, and we just had this proliferation of characters, which is kind of cool if they got made into action figures, which sometimes they do, but otherwise, it wasn't realistic. And so what we were trying to do with New Jedi Order was to do a fairly ambitious series. It was going to take 5 years. It was going to be 30 novels. And they wanted to make it this ongoing series, and they wanted to feel that there was a real threat. So we designed the Yuuzhan Vong. What we did is we went through and we said, okay, if we kill Luke, how devastating is it going to be? And one of the things that we asked, and it went up to George, was, of the main characters, can we kill anyone? Is that okay?
And I wanted to kill somebody off because I really wanted the big impact thing. I wanted to kill off Luke, and George wouldn't let me.
It was discussed that you guys were thinking of killing Luke. Were you in favor of that call?
Yeah, I would have gone along with it because, I saw this as the final series.
Yeah.
It's no secret that I wanted to kill Luke. But now that we couldn't and have done some cool things and are doing even cooler things with him, I'm glad we didn't.
Interestingly, just a few little anecdotal pieces. Interestingly, when we were deciding to kill off somebody and then who to kill off in New Jedi Order, in Vector Prime, George told us we could kill Han. That has changed since, but at the time, we were allowed to. The only ones he said we couldn't kill were Luke and Leia. And but I refused to kill Han. So
the Dark Horse guys, especially Randy Stradley, were, I think, brilliant story guys.
We went into it was a big joint meeting between Lucasfilm and Del Rey and Dark Horse. And it was pretty clear that a couple of the editors at Del Rey did not want Dark Horse involved at all.
Okay.
But the thing that really surprised me about the whole meeting was the Del Rey people came in and they said, well, we're getting this license, but we don't think there's enough interest in Star Wars, so we need to kill off one of the characters to create interest, to show them that this is something new, and they wanted to kill Luke. And I was like, what? And so that was discussed for a while, and then we broke for lunch, and when we came back, Lucy Wilson, who is head of Lucasfilm Publishing, had talked to George, and she said, no, you absolutely can't kill Luke. And, I remember the conversation at Del Rey was like, well, if you kill off Leia or you kill off Han, nobody's going to care. It won't be enough. And I said, well, there's a character you could kill off whose death whose importance would outweigh his importance to the saga.
Sure, right.
And I said, everybody cries when old Yeller dies. I said, kill the family dog. Kill Chewbacca. And they're like, oh, yeah. And so they discussed that. And then it became clear that even though I was the one that came up with the idea, the Dark Horse originated that idea.
Yeah.
Dark Horse didn't get to do anything with the storyline.
So much like Vader in Dark Times, you came in, wreaked some havoc, and then left.
Yeah.
We went through, all of us in the room, we went through and we said, if we kill any of these main characters, it was obvious that would be devastating for all the other characters. And so we accepted that. If any of the main characters die, it's going to be hideous. And then we said, if any of the main characters die, who are the characters that we can use to tell the stories to show the grief? And when you go through those main characters, Chewie was the only character that you could not use as a viewpoint character in a novel. Therefore, he was the one that we couldn't tell the story of the grief from his point of view. Therefore, he became the vulnerable one.
Everybody cries when old Yeller dies. So if you kill the family dog, it has much more emotional impact. I mean, a greater emotional impact than this. Chewie is, he's part of the team, but he doesn't really do anything. I mean, he's not having conversations with people. We're not getting inside Chewie's head in the same way that we do with the other characters. So, but his death can still have a gigantic emotional impact beyond sort of his real importance in the story.
As we explore where we take the books, because the books tell new stories in the most in-depth way, we are constantly presented with the question of, are there main characters that we kill off?
Right.
And my own bias is that I'm really reluctant to kill off big characters because it changes the story considerably. And years ago, we decided to kill off Chewbacca.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a very controversial decision. I would say that I wasn't the most popular guy for making that decision. I still have sleepless nights about it.
The death of Chewbacca. Did George himself actually sign off on that?
That, the way it worked in those days is we would have a sort of these check boxes of things that would get routed to George. Can we deal with the Sith? Can we say that the Sith are a species? Can we kill this character? And the check box is either yes or no.
Mm-hmm.
We definitely wouldn't kill off one of the major characters without getting that check box.
We were first going to kill Jason, even though I know him. And then we were told Anakin, and I suspect that's because they didn't want a confusion between the two Anakins running around at the same time. I don't know for sure.
In the early meetings, there was a question of what we were going to end up doing with Anakin. And I did not think he should die. I thought there were more interesting things we could do with him because the older brother, younger brother dynamic is one I thought we could really explore and have fun with. So when I was writing those two books, he was slated to die. And so I said, well, screw it. I am going to characterize the hell out of him so that whoever kills him is going to feel miserable. I am heavily motivated by spite. And I literally felt bad for whoever that was going to fall to. But I really hope that if I characterize him really, really well, that someone would see sense and they would relent and they would figure out other things to do with it. That was my goal in doing everything that I did with him. So.
Now, do you remember Michael Stackpole has discussed how he was personally opposed to the decision to kill Anakin? Now, as a fan, I felt that caused the beautiful resolution that could have never happened any other way. And Jason and Jaina went through a process because Anakin was killed. Right. So I'm on board with that decision. But do you remember your input in that decision, that discussion?
I think I must have been in favor of it.
Yeah.
But I don't, no strong memories about that. So Mike was against it. Actually, I do remember something like that that we had to kind of all gang up on Mike at one point. Yeah, he was pushing back. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you know what your reasoning was for why should we do this to kill this character? Or Jason if it was switched?
Well, you want those moments in fiction, that are going to affect readers and get them more invested. It's kind of a cheap shot, but it made sense because we're going to elevate another person, and if someone has to die, I mean, this is typical mythology too, where where a mentor or someone, a figure of power dies so that another person can ascend.
In the 90s, I was sort of just a fan of Star Wars, and I was kind of hanging out on the internet back when fan communities were first forming on the internet. And as a fan, the one topic that I was interested in was the planets and stuff. So I created a text document that started with Alderaan and it ended with Yavin, and it had all the planets from the Timothy Zahn books and whatever was out at the time, and there wasn't a lot.
And it was called the Star Wars Planets Guide. And it just seemed like a fun thing to share with other fans, and it was really detailed because I tend to be kind of really detailed when I need to be. Mm-hmm. And I posted it in some fan libraries and on some FTP sites. This was pre-World Wide Web.
Sure.
And a lot of people liked it. And the AOL Star Wars Fan Club, which was really active, I was really active in it like 1994, 1995. And several Star Wars authors were a part of that community as well. Tom Veitch, who wrote the Dark Empire comics, and Kevin Anderson, who wrote the Jedi Academy trilogy, were regular members of that community. And I got to know Steve Sansweet, and I got to know Kevin Anderson pretty well. And really, those guys, the guys at Lucasfilm, were the guys who said, hey, this guy knows a lot about planets. And then it was Lucy Wilson at the time, who was the director of publishing at Lucasfilm, just called me on the phone and said, hey, are you interested in writing a Star Wars book? Which, for like a fan to get a call like that, I was just floored,
Dan had gone through the Lucasfilm vetting, and he was working on the Essential Guide to Planets and Moons from the old Essential Guide series. And he was a huge geography nerd. I was a huge geography nerd, but I had made like this crazy database of every Star Wars star system I could find from any source, and information about it, best guess of where it was. I mean, there wasn't a map yet, so we didn't have a grid system, but I was trying to figure it out. But I knew Dan was working on this thing, and I didn't want him to feel like I was trying to kind of horn in on his territory. So I kept this thing to myself. And then his book came out, and we were talking about some other things. And I said, I have this database if you want to take a look at it. And I sent it to him, and he was like, why didn't you give this to me like 6 months ago? This would have been so helpful.
Yeah.
And I was like, sorry, I didn't. But, from that sort of false start, we were off to the races, and we had both loved the Atlas of Middle Earth from the late 70s, which was sort of the same thing. Tolkien, J.R.R. Tolkien made wonderful maps, but this was attempting to dig even further in and talk about like the geology and the history and stuff like that. We both loved that book, and so we really wanted a Star Wars version of that.
And then when Jason and I started communicating, and he had kept that Excel database, and we started making maps, which is a whole nother wrinkle of this, is making the new Jedi Order maps in the late 1990s, that I was like, Jason knows more than I could ever. I know a lot about planets, but Jason knows more than I could ever about how they all fit together. I helped put together one of the earliest maps back when the new Jedi Order series was being worked on, and we tried to say, okay, well, here's all the things that we know about from West End games. Like they might have described a trade route or something like that. So we put it together, and okay, I guess that could go here. Maybe it shouldn't. Maybe it doesn't belong at 2 o'clock. It belongs at 7 o'clock. And then, no, it doesn't work there. And it was a real hassle. But we eventually got one that was probably the best solution that we could come up with at the time. And my thought was, well, at least there's a map now.
So were you as excited as I was to see the map of the GFFA in Vector Prime when it came out the first time? I think that was the first time I'd seen a map of the Star Wars galaxy, and it just made me so excited that something like that actually existed.
That was, Dan and I would trade, our crazy fanboy emails about Star Wars stuff, and at one point I was lamenting that there was no map. And it was just so sad that there wasn't a map. And Dan was like, actually, there is a map. And he and Jim Lucino had developed that map for the new Jedi Order. And he was like, there is a map. Would you like to see it? I was like, yeah, I would love to see it. And he actually faxed it to me at the Journal. And I was like hopping back and forth from one foot to the other, waiting for it to unspool. And but of course, being a Star Wars dork like I am, like 5 minutes later, I was like, Ithor's in the wrong place. It can't be there. And Dan was like, I know, leave us alone. It needs to be there for the story. We've brought it up. Come on, cut it out. So yeah, that was an early introduction into what making the Atlas would be like.
It's surreal to me because in the new continuity, they use essentially that map. But from what I've been able to understand, the planetary locations are there for NJO's story, right? Weren't they?
Right.
So everybody's playing our new Jedi Order's playbook, which is so funny. But
that map was a lot of fun to do. That required a lot of crazy research, digging into all the books and every mention of like how far, how long it took to get from here to here and what system planets were in.
I like that it showed the troop moves of the Vong. It almost reminded me of like those of Civil War or other.
Right.
Was that on your mind when you were making that?
Yeah. We drew on a lot of. I can't remember. There was some history book that we were consulting in terms of invasion routes. It was probably from World War I or something, and using that as a basis for the Vong's invasion.
It almost looked like a hand. It was sort of grasping. Was that actually intentional?
That actually was deliberate.
That's so cool. Yeah. I remember when I was a teenager just opening up and going, I know where everything is now. I had no idea where everything was.
And it was really an essential part of the Bible too. I mean, that's why we did it. Initially, I thought we've got to get everybody on the same page in terms of where all these worlds were. And then it sort of became bigger and bigger. And in the beginning, I never thought that would be included in the books. It was just kind of a reference guide for writers who were going to jump into the series. And that was great when it took shape like that.
That galaxy map. Who illustrated that?
A close friend of mine named Chris Barbieri, who's an artist, did a lot of science fiction paperback covers, and he and I did many trips together, and we're carpenters together. So he was a close friend. He was an illustrator, and when Dan Wallace and I started to talk about this notion of a map, Chris seemed like the perfect person to go to. He had done a lot of maps for inserts in science fiction novels, and so he helped lay that whole thing out.
Did you have any inspirations, any previous books or any previous maps that you thought of when you wanted to work on that? Like, was there anything?
There was a kind of an earlier galactic map that we kind of used and then expanded on that. And Dan, would just had so much information at his fingertips and was, in terms of how many parsecs and how the distance between planets and what systems things were in. So he was really instrumental in helping shape that.
I think that led to the Essential Atlas, which is a wonderful book.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I know initially was it the plan that the hardbacks, the 5 hardbacks would be sort of the stars and the rest would be
that was the original idea, that, to get the full story, you would only need to read the 5 hardcovers.
Right.
But that didn't, you can't really make that work. I mean, they were promoted more, but then, the so-called fill-in books, how could you just skip over all that material?
The talented people that were assembled, which I believe Lucy was choosing, right? Or was Shelley choosing the people?
I think a lot of it was, I think Shelley would bring up names and bring them to Sue Rustoni, and Sue and Lucy would then give their okay, or Nick's, just say no.
We have a lot of different authors with different types of talents. We have an extraordinary group of talented authors who write well, who are good at character development, who are good at action and adventure, but the deeper stuff too, the things that make these books more than just, books that's something you might want to read more than once, which to me is one of the ways I define a better book. You read it more than once, you get something else out of it. We try really hard, and I think for the most part succeed in making these good novels. I mean, they're not fluff, they're good novels, and I'm very proud that we have pretty much managed to do that.